Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight, President Trump teams up with NATO allies to ramp up pressure on Vladimir Putin.
You're very unhappy I am with Russia. We're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. This is billions of dollars worth of military equipment is going to be purchased from the United States, going to NATO, etc. And that's going to be quickly distributed to the battlefield.
President Trump's new sanctions threats coming as a bipartisan group of 85 senators prepares to vote on legislation that would impose even more devastating economic restrictions on Russia, as well as the countries they say indirectly finance Putin's war efforts. We'll discuss with one of the bill's co-sponsors, the ranking Democrat on the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, and later with Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, with more analysis on the potential impacts of all these actions against Russia.
And President Trump threatens the EU with 30% tariffs, but says he's still willing to talk as European trade ministers meet to strategize ahead of the new August 1st deadline.
We can be tough if the White House wants us to be tough.
The USA is taking a risk of the countermeasures, and the tolls cannot be one-sided.
The Commission should be more adamant, should be more efficient, should be more assertive in making sure that the European interests prevail.
We'll have more when Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and Head of Public Policy at Pimco, joins us.
Plus, Bitcoin touching another record high today as the House kicks off what they're calling Crypto Week on Capitol Hill. Why there's little sign investor enthusiasm is slowing as lawmakers increase the pressure to pass key crypto regulation legislation.
All of that is ahead, but we begin tonight with President Trump's announcements on Ukraine and Russia from earlier today. And for more, we turn to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan. So, Kate, obviously there were kind of two parts, one being the weaponry Ukraine is about to receive indirectly from the U.S. It's really NATO that will be coordinating it. The other is the threat of these higher secondary tariffs. Talk to us about what a secondary tariff actually might entail.
That is a great question. And there was some confusion today over what Trump was actually talking about, because he said tariffs and then there were some questions about whether he meant sanctions. Howard Lutnick seemed to suggest that he meant sanctions, but then walked that back. We did get an answer from Matt Whitaker, so Trump's ambassador to NATO, who did say that he was talking about secondary sanctions, sanctions on countries that are buying the oil from Russia. So that, of course, then would target India and China as as we're looking at what this actually is going to entail. There could be a huge ripple effect here. This is also coming as the United States is sort of negotiating new trade deals with India and Russia and China as well. And so I think we're still trying to get a sense of what exactly this is going to look like. I would say that there's also a long runway here. So he was talking about 50 days from now that these would go into effect if there is no deal. That gives Russia a lot of time. I think a lot can be done on the battlefield in that time. And so I guess we're still waiting to see how this is going to play out.
A lot of civilians could die in that time based on what we've been seeing with Russia targeting residential neighborhoods. The weapons component of the announcement today with the Secretary General of NATO is interesting. We're going to talk to Senator Shaheen about this in a moment. The idea that you'll still be getting American weapons, but NATO will pay for them. How is this going to work?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think that this gives Trump a lot of political cover because his base is not so into the idea of the United States getting directly involved in this war, providing weapons directly to Ukraine. And Trump on the campaign trail talked a lot about how he did not want to do that. He talked a lot about how the United States was too involved in this war. So the way he laid it out today, the United States, NATO would buy weapons from the United States. There are still a lot of questions about how exactly this would get paid for, how Europe would pay for this, but then those weapons would get distributed to Ukraine as needed. And so it's a very interesting pay structure. It's not a typical, the way that under the Biden administration had been doing it was more just providing weapons that Congress had authorized these weapon sales, weapons to Ukraine. And so I think under, Trump so far, they were allowing those that had been previously authorized to go through, but not approving new weapon sales. So definitely very significant. Like I said, 50 days is a long time, but what Trump was talking about today is that these weapons could get there within a few days. Now, we'll see if that actually happens, but that's what he was talking about, a quick time frame when it comes to these weapons.
Possibly weapons coming out of European stockpiles right now. Kate, thank you so much for your great reporting today. Kate Sullivan helps to cover the White House for us here at Bloomberg. And during the announcement with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte this morning at the White House, President Trump was asked about Senate Republicans' plans for additional Russian sanctions. Here's what he said.
The Republicans are moving very strongly in the Senate, giving us total control of it, but I'm not sure we need it, but it's certainly good that they're doing it. They've actually crafted a pretty good piece of legislation. It's probably going to pass very easily, and that includes Democrats. And there's some little tweaks, but I don't want to say I don't need it because I don't want them to waste their time. It could be very useful. We'll have to see.
Joining us now with more on all of this in reaction to President Trump's announcement today, the Senate's plan for additional Russian sanctions, we turn to Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, who's ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got a lot of questions about what we heard today in the Oval Office, and I suspect that you may have some questions as well. When it comes to the idea of sanctions, whether it's coming from the Senate or something, I guess, that would be announced from the White House itself, what do you make of the president's decision to give this another 50 days? Is this the right move right now?
I think what we have seen is that Vladimir Putin is not going to come to the table to negotiate in any real serious way unless he is feeling a lot more pressure than he has to date from the Trump administration. So I think we need to take up and pass the Graham-Blumenthal legislation that has 85 co-sponsors in the Senate. It's bipartisan. It would send a very strong message to Putin and the Russians and all of those who continue to do business with Russia, buying Russian oil, that the United States is serious and we are paying attention to what's going on. I think the announcement that NATO is going to provide weapons, particularly those Patriot missile defense systems that Ukraine so desperately needs as they are under nightly attack from Russia against Kyiv and civilian populations all across the country, is welcome news, and we need to do everything we can to see that that moves as quickly as possible.
Senator, President Trump suggested in the Oval Office today that there's no real difference between a 100% secondary tariff on a country like China or India that's buying Russian oil compared to the 500% in the piece of legislation we're discussing. What to you would change the calculus for Russia when we're comparing a 100% levy like this to 500%?
Listen, I think if we are serious and if we actually implement those sanctions and follow through and ensure that we police them in ways that prevent India, China, the countries that are buying oil from Russia with a shadow fleet from actually being able to buy that fuel to be able to reimburse Russia for those costs, then we are going to go a long way towards shutting down Russia's war machine because they will not have the funding they need to continue to operate it.
Would love your thoughts on this weapons arrangement that the president rolled out today, Senator, as a key lawmaker who supported the Biden administration's efforts to arm Ukraine. What do you think of this idea as we get to the end of the weapons package that you already approved, having NATO buy American weapons and provide them to Kyiv? Will Ukraine get what it needs? Is this sustainable?
Well, I think it's an important step forward. At the NATO summit, I had a chance to meet with President Zelensky. He talked about the willingness of Ukraine to pay for weapons that they were not expecting a handout. We also talked to a number of European leaders who were talking about how they could continue to provide Ukraine with what they need for weapons and buy some of those weapons from the U.S. Of course, NATO is the best way to do that. And we know that we have seized Russian assets in Europe, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in those seized assets. There is interest coming in on what's the holdings of those assets that can be used for some of these weapons purchases. So I think however we can make that work is important, because the most critical thing is to ensure that Ukraine gets what it needs to continue the conduct of this war, to fight back against Russia, and that we put significant pressure on Vladimir Putin and Russia to get to the negotiating table. The fact is, I'm pleased to see the turnaround in President Trump's language. He finally seems to understand that he's been played by Vladimir Putin for months, and he seems to be getting serious about ensuring that we do something to put pressure on Russia.
Well, if pressure on Russia might necessitate pressure on China, Senator, as we consider this prospect of secondary sanctions or tariffs, however we want to characterize that, knowing China is such an important trading partner of ours, that's why so much focus has been put on the level of tariffs our country and theirs have on each other. Do you worry about the potential economic ramifications here at home?
I don't. And in fact, what we have done today as a minority report from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is to release a report, here it is, on the impact that is happening because of America's retreat across the world and the opening that gives to China. So I think it's very important for us to take strong action. China has moved in where the United States has shut down foreign assistance programs. They started doing that in days, describing China as the reliable partner and the United States as a partner that was not reliable. So it's important for us to keep the commitment that we make to our allies and partners.
Well, it's important that you bring up this report from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I wonder your thoughts if, in fact, these sanctions are put into effect, if that would have the impact on China that many suspect. But also, you're referring to the outreach that we've seen here from USAID and the effort to claw back some of the funding in this rescissions package that's before you now in the Senate has raised a lot of questions for Democrats about whether it will be possible to work with Republicans. Will that pass, that rescissions package, to begin with the USAID and NPR, PBS cuts? And if it does, will Democrats join Republicans in crafting a budget for the next fiscal year, or are talks officially off?
Well, we are working, I'm on the Appropriations Committee. We are working on the budget for the upcoming year. We already passed 2 bills out of the Appropriations Committee, Agriculture, where I'm the ranking member, and the programs that fund the operations of the Capitol and the legislative branch here. So I think that's positive progress. And the fact is, our Republican colleagues, in a bipartisan way, Republicans and Democrats, have expressed concern about the threat that China poses to the United States. It's an economic threat, it's a military threat. And if we want to compete with China, as this report shows, then we need to be much more strategic about what our vision is. We need to stop rolling back our diplomatic efforts around the world. The soft power, the foreign assistance, that has been the hallmark of America's foreign policy for the last 60 years. We need to stop putting tariffs on our allies and partners who help make us as strong as we are. There are significant national security and economic implications for what this administration has done in terms of rolling back our ability to compete with China.
All right, Senator, we appreciate your time. Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, the Supreme Court lets President Trump resume dismantling the Department of Education. We'll bring you those details. But first, Trump indicates he's open to more trade negotiations, including with the EU. We'll discuss the impact on markets with Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and Head of Public Policy for Pimco, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's doing a fantastic job. He goes on television and he calms the market. I go on television, I rile the market, and I say, we better send him in there, Howard, right? And the markets become so calm and nice, so you're doing a good job.
President Trump earlier today discussing how his words impact markets, how his Treasury Secretary elicits a different response. Maybe you've noticed. For the latest on how Wall Street is reacting to the president's tariff updates over the weekend, we turn now to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's live at World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, we've come a long way. A couple months ago, Saturday, the president announces new tariffs on Mexico and the EU, and we would have been on a roller coaster. Today, we closed modestly higher. What do we make of that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you would play that clip, a moment of introspection from the president. But the reality is the market, to a certain degree, is starting to look through a lot of his comments. You saw that, of course, with a lot of the tariff headlines that crossed over the last, 3 or 4 days, first with Brazil, then with Canada, Mexico, the EU, and a market looking through that, not so much because they don't think there will be follow through, but they don't necessarily think the follow through will be as severe as what he initially says. And there's been a pattern, right? The idea that you sort of start high with some of these tariffs, maybe by the time those countries negotiate what they want, you get something a lot lower. The end result is you're still elevated, but it's something that the market could live with. You saw that with the NASDAQ 100 today that traded once again around a record high, an S&P that's not far off of it. And we're heading into both two very consequential things happening over the next few days, Joe and Kaylee, and that's a CPI report, an inflation report tomorrow, and earnings results that are going to start to trickle in starting tomorrow as well. And no one on Wall Street right now is really expecting the worst. They think the inflation report, while somewhat elevated, will be still relatively benign, and they think that the earnings reports that we're about to get aren't necessarily going to reflect any real material damage to corporate bottom lines as a direct result of tariffs and trade policy.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in New York for us. Thank you so much. Now, this morning on Bloomberg, economic analysts were discussing the impact of President Trump's ever-evolving trade policy and tariff deadlines and when consumers might actually start seeing the impact.
It would be best case scenario for everyone involved to find some sort of landing zone in terms of these bilateral negotiations with countries and to see a bunch of deals get inked.
It's very clear that our trading partners abroad are not paying for it. You would typically see their currencies devaluing if that were the case. So it's either companies are going to be paying for it or consumers are going to be paying for it.
It hasn't really started showing up in a way that would really suggest the consumer is truly feeling this. But I expect that to start happening once we get into back to school season and probably Christmas.
So when will the market start caring more if that's about to start happening? We turn now for an answer to that question and others to Libby Cantrill, Managing Director and Head of Public Policy at Pimco, who's also joining us from New York. And Libby, in your latest note out to clients, you say you would take the other side of the taco trade on trade matters specifically. Why is the market wrong to be looking through this to such a degree?
Yeah, well, I think also, Kaylee, it depends on which market you're talking about. I mean, the equity market is absolutely looking through this pretty sanguine at this point, and I think some could argue kind of price for perfection, if you will. The fixed income market, maybe a little bit more nuanced, pricing in more slow growth, partly as a result of those tariffs. But I think just broadly speaking, there is this complacence around tariffs. And I think that the initial conditions here matter, Kaylee. As a reminder, we started this year with a 3% effective average tariff rate, the tariff rate that we're imposing on all U.S. Imports across the board. It is now around 14%. We could see that go north of 20% should all of these tariffs, plus some of the sector tariffs that the president has threatened, roll on. So the tariff rates are already high right now. So regardless of what happens on August 1st, we think that you will start seeing this economy slowing. The growth will start slowing. We think that the inflation could pick up, probably not in tomorrow's print necessarily, but certainly in that sort of September kind of fall timeframe that was just referred to. So, I think that, again, a lot of these metrics that the market is responding to are backward looking. They are not forward looking. And we still expect that the economy will slow partly as a result of these tariffs.
Well, you just answered, Libby, my question certainly about CPI tomorrow. But I'll tell you, Peter Navarro joined us on Friday here and made a very compelling argument that tariffs do not cause inflation. And you've heard this argument from the administration. The fact of the matter is, though, the U.S. just today is imposing a 17% tariff on tomatoes from Mexico. And just imagine how many products that's going to hit. To your point, it could take months before we see that turn out in the data, right? If it's starting today, when do we feel it at the store?
Yeah, well, so tariffs obviously are a tax, and someone's going to pay that tax, whether it is exporters, and there has been some evidence that, manufacturers, producers, exporters are paying for some of it, or it's corporate importers, the corporations that are importing the goods, and or it's the consumer. So one of those sort of stakeholders invariably is going to be paying this tariff, and inevitably, we do think that the consumer will feel it. Now, will they, like back in the 2018, 2019 tariff example with China, that was passed on almost completely to consumers. There is, again, some evidence that that is not happening as of now. But invariably, this will make its way into the economy. And, as we've said, we think it will result into slower growth, maybe not as happening as quickly for a variety of reasons, front loading, again, some of the corporations sort of eating the tariff. But we do think it's more of a question of when and not if at this point.
Well, and that's the very thing that is holding the Federal Reserve back, it seems, Libby, from cutting interest rates, which we know does not leave President Trump very satisfied with the current state of monetary policy, to the extent now that the administration seems to be pursuing very heavily this idea that the chair of the Fed lied to Congress about the renovations to the Eccles and other Fed buildings here in Washington, maybe looking for justification for firing for cause. Would you tell clients to actually be worried about a potential ouster of the Fed chair?
What we've guided our clients to really from the beginning of this administration is that we should expect the president to jawbone Fed Chair Powell, the Fed just broadly. He wants lower rates for good reason, right? I mean, there are lots of reasons why the president would want lower rates, lower interest expense for one reason. But so not surprising. But we do think there's quite a difference between the rhetoric and the reality of firing Powell. We do not anticipate the president doing that. He's indicated he will not do that. And of course, he's going to have some opportunities in a not too distant future to really remake the Fed. Adriana Kugler's term is up in January of 2026. You could see a retirement or resignation of another Fed board governor before then. It's theoretically possible. But then, of course, Powell's term is up in May. So in really short order here, Kayleigh, he's going to actually have a chance to put his own fingerprints on the Fed. And as a result, we do not expect him to fire Powell. The last thing I will just say on this is it could make it much harder for him to get whomever he wants to confirmed at the Fed, especially if he fires Powell, but even if he continues to really politicize the Fed. So that is something we are encouraging our clients to watch. But no, we do not think Powell is going anywhere as of now.
Happy Crypto Week, Libby, if no one said that to you yet. I'm curious your thoughts on $120,000 for Bitcoin today. As Crypto Week gets underway in Washington, we're talking about the Genius Act that's expected to pass. The Clarity Act, not so much, based on your note to clients. And there's been a lot of back and forth between Democrats and Republicans on this. In our remaining moment, when you consider Bitcoin, how it might benefit from the Clarity Act passing, are investors getting a little ahead of themselves here? What do they think they're investing in? Or does this have nothing to do with Washington?
Yeah, I think, we do not necessarily trade actively Bitcoin at Pimco. But of course, we are monitoring this. This is an important asset class for a lot of our clients. And we do welcome, I think, like many market participants, some sort of regulatory clarity. As you mentioned, though, that the Clarity Act, which is this broad sort of sweeping market structure bill for all digital assets, we don't think that is necessarily going to pass quickly in the Senate, even if it does pass the House. So there's a long road ahead. The stablecoin bill, though, the Genius Act, will likely pass the House and be signed into law. So I do think there will be, that's going to be welcomed by investors for sure.
Great to have you back, Libby. Libby Cantrill, Managing Director, Head of Public Policy at Pimco. We thank you. Coming up, the Supreme Court letting President Trump continue his purge of the Education Department. We'll have a lot more on that ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We make the best equipment, the best missiles, the best of everything. The European nations know that. And we made a deal today. We are going to be sending them weapons, and they're going to be paying for them. The United States will not be having any payment made. We're not buying it, but we will manufacture it, and they're going to be paying for it.
President Trump in the Oval Office earlier today sharing U.S. plans now to send a top-of-the-line weapons package to Ukraine, as he described it, pledging that while the U.S., as you just heard, will be making the weapons, NATO will be buying the weapons. And joining us now with some details on this arrangement. Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, who helps to cover the Pentagon for us. Courtney, it's great to have you back on Balance of Power. There was some disappointment among military analysts, those supporting Ukraine, that there weren't more offensive, longer-range missiles that Ukraine could use to take the fight to Russia. But what are they getting in this plan?
Well, right now, we don't have a ton of specifics. We know that Ukraine stands to receive Patriot anti-missile systems and additional interceptors, which, President Zelensky has been very clear are really key to defending, especially civilian populations.
And how quickly can Ukraine get Patriots that maybe already are in Europe? And how quickly could the U.S. then replenish those stocks? How much of these, frankly, do we have to go around?
Well, I mean, they're certainly in high demand. There are, interceptors that had already been purchased and were paused in terms of delivery to Ukraine. So those could potentially move faster. But it takes quite some time to manufacture an entire Patriot battery, which involves launchers, radar systems, and, of course, those interceptors.
Yeah, with that in mind, the president suggested that we might be drawing down from European supplies and then backfilling. There could be a couple different scenarios in the way this works, which makes it sound a little more complicated. Is this sustainable for us?
I mean, the urgency, from the European perspective is certainly there. And so I think certain allies are a little bit more willing, perhaps, to transfer weapons with the expectation of backfilling.
Well, I was just, again, wondering the question of timing there. But quickly, Courtney, before we let you go, it is highly likely Ukraine has its hands on these weapons in some form before we get to that 50-day deadline the president said exists to breach a ceasefire deal with Russia.
That's certainly the hope. The German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, is in Washington today and is hoping to get 2 additional batteries to Ukraine as soon as possible.
All right. Bloomberg's Courtney McBride covering the Pentagon for us. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more analysis is Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute. She's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine under the Obama administration. Evelyn, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's always great to have you. When we consider the kind of dual announcements the president made today, one on these Patriot and other weapon systems, the other being, of course, a threat of 100% secondary tariffs on buyers of Russian oil if there's no ceasefire agreement in 50 days. Which provides greater incentive to Vladimir Putin to reach some kind of agreement? Do either?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Haley, they're both really important. So clearly we want to make sure that Ukraine has the weapons that it needs to defend itself. Obviously, it would be even better if Ukraine could use some of the weapons to strategically essentially deliver blows to Russia that are decisive. So some of these long-range weapons, maybe they could do that. The other part, though, is economic. Putin can't go forever with this war, and certainly those people around him, his elites, have to be watching the impact on them. So the sanctions could be significant. I think they're sanctions and not tariffs that the president was referring to. My understanding is that the White House cleared that up. But either way, economic pressure is also important. But I would say the military pressure is more important because that comes faster.
Well, when we consider the military needs right now, Evelyn, we also consider the number of forces working against Ukraine right now. Helping to animate this on the early edition of Balance of Power was retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, who talked to us about who Ukraine is really fighting in this war with Russia or many others. Take a listen.
Ukraine is fighting 4 countries: Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And in fact, Russia today is firing more artillery from North Korea than their own. In other words, the majority of the artillery being used by Russia is North Korean. All 3 of these countries, as axis of authoritarians, are supporting the 4th, Russia, in this fight. And that's who Ukraine's been going against. So that's probably why it's appropriate for the United States and Europe to assist with at least with equipment, but not forces.
An incredible threat, Evelyn, as you well know. And I'm wondering, considering the constraints on capacity that we've been talking so much about, once again, the lack of a defense industrial base that can actually begin to crank out more shells and more missile interceptors. Is it too late to turn the tide?
So it's never too late. I think that some good equipment, and a lot of equipment, and again, speed is important. We heard not just my good friend, the Admiral Montgomery, talk about speed of delivery, but also the NATO Secretary General sitting next to President Trump talked about the need for speed. We can ramp up our military production, but we need to make some political decisions in order to do so. And I think it is high time that we did it. We have to demonstrate, as Admiral Montgomery said, this is a fight that we're fighting not just against Russia to benefit Ukraine and the international order, but it's a fight that we're fighting to show China that they can't get away with doing something similar, whether it's in the South China Sea or against Taiwan. So we need to ramp up our production. We need to be able to show that we can also deliver quickly.
Well, and so to effectively show that, Evelyn, does Congress also need to get involved here? The president today was suggesting he can take the sanctions action on his own. Unclear if they would need to pass the Lindsey Graham bill in the Senate in order to do this. But if we're talking about greater investments into the defense industrial base, if we're talking about supporting Ukraine potentially in a more robust way for a longer period of time, aren't they going to have to go back to lawmakers?
Yes. I mean, basically, they need the money from Congress. They also need the authority. They need to make sure that they can, do whatever they need to do with regard to procurement and production that Congress will allow. And Congress is ultimately the authority that can loosen and get rid of some of the, red tape that makes all of this so difficult, or loosen the purse strings so that the defense industry can ramp up and know that they will have some certainty of customer down the line. So, there are many things where Congress ultimately has to get involved. The corporate sector will not want just an executive order. Again, it gets back to an understanding that Congress is behind what the administration's doing. And frankly, our adversaries understand enough about our system to know that if you have a bipartisan, piece of legislation sanctioning Russia with overwhelming support from Republicans, Democrats, House and Senate, and the president, then America is speaking with one very strong voice.
Boy, we've come a long way from that Oval Office meeting a few months ago here, Evelyn. But the idea of this Congress approving more money for weapons in Ukraine could be a tall order. What if that's not possible politically in this country? Is the plan with NATO enough?
I think the plan with NATO is enough, Joe, because if NATO, and frankly, there's a large overlap of membership, can go to the European Union and say, look, European Union, we need funds. The European Union has the ability to unfreeze the Russian frozen assets, and there are about 300 billion of them. The United States has authority over some smaller component of that 300 billion, some small fraction of it. And so the Europeans have the ability to pay. Thus far, they've not been willing to unfreeze those funds. But if they did, if there was no U.S. funding forthcoming, then I'm positive they would, because they understand in Europe that they are next if they don't stop Putin in Ukraine.
Well, when we consider a potential stop to this war in Ukraine, the president obviously now has a 50-day deadline in place. Evelyn, it may be an unfair question, but knowing the president and those in his administration, including his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, are also simultaneously trying to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. Which do you think has greater likelihood of happening first?
Probably Gaza, because I think that the Israeli government and the Israeli state is in a position now where there is no, serious threat being posed by Hamas. It's really down to a question of whether Prime Minister Netanyahu can make a deal with his opposition, with the members of his coalition who can stomach a deal over the future of the Palestinians that allows him to essentially turn his back on the far right, which only wants, a Jewish state and not a state for the Palestinians. So I think that the ingredients are there for a deal on Gaza. And unfortunately, I don't see that even providing these weapons to Ukraine right now will turn the tide in the very near future or within 50 days.
Well, I believe we're moving Patriots from the Middle East to provide to Ukraine. Are we able to balance both of these at once, Evelyn?
Yes. I mean, Joe, of course, it's tricky. And if you ask our military, they will always tell you they don't have enough. And fair enough, you always want to be conservative if you're in the military. But we do have enough. And our allies are moving, their patriots as well. And not just the Middle Eastern allies, of course, but the European allies, they're leaving themselves somewhat more vulnerable, relatively speaking. But again, the understanding is that if Russia's not defeated in Ukraine, Russia will, use its military elsewhere. And the number one target, is NATO. And of course, those NATO members that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So we don't want war with Russia. The best way to prevent that, frankly, is to stop them in Ukraine.
She speaks from experience. Evelyn Farkas, great to have you back, Evelyn, Executive Director of Arizona State University's McCain Institute, as always, on Bloomberg. Coming up, a divided Supreme Court will let President Trump resume his plans to dismantle the Department of Education. We'll bring you the details coming up when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. Here are some of the other stories that we're following this evening in tonight's Power Brief. The Defense Department says 4 U.S. AI developers will each receive contracts of up to $200 million. The deals with Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Elon Musk's xAI are aimed at accelerating the military's adoption of the emerging technology. The contracts are a major revenue stream for the AI companies, which have been looking to expand their reach into the public sector. xAI is the developer of Grok, the chatbot under fire for posting anti-Semitic content on Musk's X social media platform. These agreements would also allow other federal agencies to leverage the AI tools through a partnership with the General Services Administration.
The Supreme Court says the Trump administration can resume its purge of the Department of Education, lifting a lower court's ruling that required the reinstatement of 1,400 workers. In a 6-3 ruling, the court granted an emergency request to put on hold a federal district ruling that found the job cuts would leave the agency unable to operate as required by law. The Supreme Court order will apply while the case continues on appeal.
And former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo says he will stay in the New York City mayoral race and run as an independent. He joins New York City's current Democratic mayor, Eric Adams, also running for re-election as an independent. Cuomo lost the Democratic primary last month to Zohran Mamdani by 12 points. A source tells Bloomberg Cuomo intends to drop out of the race in early September if he isn't the highest polling opponent against Mamdani. We should point out former Mayor Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg News parent company Bloomberg LP, endorsed Cuomo in the primary and has contributed to his PAC.
And joining us now with reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel. Annalise Keller is with us, partner at 7 Letter and Republican strategist, alongside Bloomberg Politics contributor and Democratic analyst Jeanne Shaheen, who's a senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. Jeanne, there's a lot we want to discuss tonight, but just your reaction to Andrew Cuomo actually making it official that he's going to stay in this mayoral race as an independent. You're up in New York. How potentially disruptive of a force could that be? Does that guarantee Mamdani becomes the next mayor?
I think that's what there's a lot of concern about. I mean, one thing we've talked about up here is that when you have a former Governor Cuomo in the race and you also have the current mayor in the race, they can split the black vote, ushering Mamdani in. That is one big concern. I think it's important that former Governor Cuomo has said he will drop out if he's not the highest polling in September. And it will be curious to hear, I don't suspect we will, if Mayor Adams would say the same. That would narrow the field a bit and give voters a chance to choose one or the other as opposed to split their vote.
Annalise, you licking your chops over this? Donald Trump says Mamdani cannot run the city of New York, but he wants him as a political foil, does he not? Doesn't the whole party?
Yes, I think he is sort of a symbol of what Republicans are showing, that this is what Democrats are wanting to become. And it is sort of everything that Donald Trump has said that Democrats are heading towards when it comes to, things like rent control and other policies that Republicans feel like they can really take on head on. I think there is a lot that he will potentially give the Republicans to work with there. Absolutely.
When we consider what Republicans are currently working on, if not with, at least on Capitol Hill, they're facing a deadline this week, Annalise, of Friday, to pass a rescissions package, $9.4 billion in cuts to funding for PBS, NPR, and USAID. It is obviously something that isn't sitting well with all Republicans, even as President Trump suggests they need to vote for this legislation or risk losing his support. How ultimately do you see this going down?
I think it will pass. Remember, they can...
As is?
Well, the Senate's going to change it. I mean, so it's already passed the House, so it's with the Senate. You're right, they have until July 18th, or the money returns, or it has to be spent, rather. So these clawbacks, they can lose 3 in the Senate. What I anticipate will happen is that Senator Susan Collins will provide pretty significant changes. I think they're working out the details of what she would like to see and what the White House can agree to now, and then that will move to the Senate floor. They can lose 3 there. I think the people to watch are McConnell, Tillis, Murkowski, and Collins. They'll have to strike some type of deal. I really don't think they get Collins either way, frankly. So they have to get something that, softens it. And then they're going to jam the House, which is what they did with reconciliation. And the House will have to swallow it.
We spoke with a senator earlier this hour about this, a Democratic senator, Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, about this rescissions package and the budget that would then have to be crafted for the next fiscal year. Take a listen.
We are working on the budget for the upcoming year. We already passed 2 bills out of the Appropriations Committee, Agriculture, where I'm the ranking member, and the programs that fund the operations of the Capitol and the legislative branch here. So I think that's positive progress. And the fact is, our Republican colleagues, in a bipartisan way, Republicans and Democrats, have expressed concern about the threat that China poses to the United States.
Referring to the cutting of for rescission of USAID funding. Jeannie, if this is correct here, if Annalise is correct, and this bill passes, are senators like Jeanne Shaheen out in the cold when it comes to writing a budget for next fiscal year? Nobody's going to get along or trust each other after that, right?
Yeah, what's new, Joe Matthew? Nobody trusts each other on Capitol Hill anyway, but I do think this is deeply disturbing because what we're seeing in so many areas, and it's so clear in this case, is that Congress is giving up its power. It is allocating funding, and then it is allowing the White House to come back and claw that funding back. And so how can the Democrats be expected to say, let's work with you to pass a budget for next year, when they're expecting that the minute that budget is passed and it goes to the White House and is signed into law, somebody's going to come back and claw that money back. This is no way to budget. It is no way to run a government. And it really does undermine the power of the first branch of government. And while the Supreme Court is so active in making decisions on EOs, I wish it would also take a look at the clawbacks and the rescissions as a violation of separation of powers. That is just my view.
Well, when we consider the bipartisan budget and appropriations process, this is, of course, coming off of a partisan budget reconciliation effort that was hard fought, even though the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is now, of course, law. The chair of the House Budget Committee, Jody Arrington, sat down with our colleague David Gura in New York today and suggested to him he's trying to do a second budget reconciliation bill by the end of the year. And you're already laughing, Annalise. There's no chance, right?
I don't think so. There is a sort of really interesting conversation going on about trying to use reconciliation for a budget process. It's really wonky, and I won't get into it. I don't think it's viable. They would have to go through the authorizing committee.
To pass a fiscal year budget through reconciliation?
There is some chatter about doing that. I don't think that will happen. What I think is more likely is this Reconciliation 2.0 has become everything to everybody because it's a way to get your vote now and make a promise that, hey, we're going to do this again a second and a third time. And then you're going to get the thing that you really want that you didn't get, that we weren't able to pass in the beginning. That's what I think is more likely. But, keep an eye on some additional conversation around maybe some folks trying to.
What are you going to do with that, Jeannie? A second reconciliation move to actually pass a budget, then presumably without Democrats. You have no reason to show up till the midterms in that world, right?
Absolutely. And more important than as for Democrats, let's talk about for the American people and good budgeting and good governance. What happened to regular order, folks? This is no way to run a government. I can't say it enough. And yes, I agree with Annalise. They will try to do this. And I don't think it'll pass. But this is not just Republicans, Democrats as well. We need a Congress that functions in the way Congress is a democracy should. And it is not in this way, and it's not via CR either. It is regular order.
Jeannie, while we're on the subject of Democrats, I do want to ask you about the man who was leading the Democratic Party up until, I guess, January technically, but really July of last year when he left his re-election effort. President Biden sat down for an interview with the New York Times, admitting in part to using Autopen to sign mass clemency orders and pardon orders that he didn't necessarily review one by one. Is now the right time for him to be reinserting himself into the news cycle like this?
Not if you ask Democrats, Kayleigh. There is not a Democrat in the world who thought this was the day, this was the week. Donald Trump is having a pretty rough time of it between Epstein, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, you name it. And up pops Joe Biden again, where nobody wanted him, talking to the New York Times. By the way, the first interview he's done with the New York Times, he didn't even do one as president. So no, not good timing. And yes, we do need to revisit this way of pardoning. It is not the way it should be done. It should not be done as categories via this Autopen. It should be done individually. That's the way our justice system works. And by the way, Donald Trump, we need to think about how he did the J6 people as well.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this idea of pardoning hundreds of people, in the case of Joe Biden, thousands, I think it was 4,000 in one lot, categorical pardons. So you set the parameters, Annalise, you let somebody else put the names in there. How big of a problem is this going to be for Democrats?
I think it's a pretty big problem. Republicans are going to want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about the Epstein files.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Well, some Republicans do.
Sure. Let me rephrase. Donald Trump does not want to talk about the Epstein files, and nor does Pam Bondi. So I think it is a really easy pivot for them to start talking about continued investigations.
He didn't look at each January 6th case, though, did he? I mean, that's something that you can't compare these two presidents with.
Yeah, you can, but I think that it's going to. I frankly don't think that that's gonna be coming up. I think what he's gonna say is this is another reason that Republicans need to continue investigating Biden, the way that staff were running the office, the way that he was not making decisions, and I mean this article made it pretty clear that the staff were making the decisions there.
We only have 30 seconds left, Annalise, but on the Epstein thing, is this division within the MAGA base over Epstein a real thing, or you think it blows over?
I think it's a real thing right now. It's a little too early to say if it blows over. What I can't really figure out is how he navigates out of this. I don't really feel like a firing ends this conversation. There sort of has to be something to kind of turn the corner, and maybe that's a news cycle. We'll see.
We will see. This isn't going away anytime soon. Annalise Keller, Jeanne Shaheen, many thanks for the great panel and great conversation. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And we'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.